Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. In this session, we're going to talk about the practice of entrepreneurship. In this presentation, we'll talk briefly about why entrepreneurship is likely different from what you previously thought. We'll identify some of the types of entrepreneurship, and we'll talk about the idea of entrepreneurship being a method. So, one of the best ways to think about entrepreneurship is as a set of behaviors. It involves how you think, the actions that you choose. A core piece of entrepreneurship is about identifying opportunities. In many ways, that's how we define entrepreneurial action, the process of identifying opportunities and then taking action to create change. All of that then can also be described as an approach to solving problems. It's a way of thinking about the world in which you're focused on identifying solutions. The issue that I generally find, however, is that many individuals' perspective of entrepreneurship has been skewed by the way that popular media depicts entrepreneurs. The popular media tends to focus on inspirational stories of success. The billionaires who generated their value overnight, the innovators who come up with incredible inventions that have huge impact. And these are important to recognize. It's wonderful to have these stories and to celebrate those kinds of successes when appropriate. But it also ignores thousands of hours of incredibly hard work by those individuals and a certain amount of luck that those individuals benefit from. The reality of entrepreneurship, and in particular startups, really looks quite different. For every Mark Zuckerberg, there are tens of thousands of entrepreneurial stories that you don't hear. People who came up with ideas and tried to propagate them unsuccessfully, or who didn't achieve the kind of success that some of the more famous entrepreneurs have generated. The vast majority of entrepreneurs don't raise outside capital, and their organizations don't grow beyond 5 employees. More than 90% of all American companies are small businesses, and the vast majority of them are actually sole proprietorships with just one person working for themselves. The average compensation for entrepreneurs is lower than it is for corporate employees. The hours are longer and they tend to be more stressful. So this goes back to the point I made in the introductory presentation that if you just want to make money, there are probably better ways to do it. On the other hand, entrepreneurs report consistently higher work satisfaction. And that's why I think that the reason to become an entrepreneur is because there's something you want to accomplish, and entrepreneurship is the right vehicle to make it happen. There are some important truths about entrepreneurship that your textbook talks about, and I want to reiterate. Entrepreneurship is not just for startups. Entrepreneurship happens across a variety of contexts. Entrepreneurs don't have a special set of personality traits. Yes, some people have some natural capabilities that can be very helpful in being an entrepreneur, but there's no single set of traits that guarantees that someone will or won't be entrepreneurial. Entrepreneurship can be taught, obviously, otherwise we wouldn't really teach this course. It's one thing to learn about entrepreneurship, it's another to try to be entrepreneurial, but most of the skills associated with entrepreneurship can in fact be taught. It's a common misperception that entrepreneurs are risk takers, and that's just not supported by the research. Entrepreneurs may be considered calculated risk takers, but that's no different than anyone else. And if you give a risk assessment to individuals, you'll discover that entrepreneurs don't score consistently higher on it. Entrepreneurs are often depicted as these lone wolves, right? Individuals who fight against industries and societies. And that's a wonderful story, especially in Hollywood. But the reality is that entrepreneurs collaborate more than they compete. They act more than they plan. Some amount of planning is valuable, but in reality what defines entrepreneurship is their choices and their actions. And something that I think is incredibly important, the idea that entrepreneurship is a life skill. It's something that you try and develop, and it's useful in a variety of contexts. A useful way to think about entrepreneurship is that it's everywhere. Sure, it's in startup companies, but you'll find it in education and government, large corporations, sometimes called intrapreneurship. One of my favorite areas of entrepreneurship is actually nonprofits. You can find it in things like franchising or acquiring a small business that already existed. It's very present in family business, family enterprise. You'll find it in your day-to-day life. The odds are good that you're entrepreneurial more often than you realize because you see something that needs to be changed and you take action to change it. It's also present in a lot of social initiatives, whether as a nonprofit or even without an organizational structure. One of my favorites is March for Our Lives, one of the greatest examples of entrepreneurship that I know of from the past 10 years, where a bunch of students who'd been affected by the shootings at Parkland School went from nothing at all, no resources, no money, just a terrible tragedy and a lot of drive and passion to a nationwide movement. So again, my definition of entrepreneurship, it's identifying an opportunity and taking action to create change, and you can see that in any organizational or social context. A good way of thinking about entrepreneurship is that it's a method, not a process. And I know that that distinction may not be immediately obvious to you. A process is something that you follow through step by step. Imagine the instructions that come with IKEA furniture, right? So you open up the box and there's all these parts and there's a booklet. And if you follow the booklet step by step, you're pretty much going to get a desk at the end, right? It's not like you're going to start working on it and then it turns out you thought it was a desk, but it's actually an end table or a bed, right? Entrepreneurship is more of a method, right? There's no single book that can tell you step by step what you need to do. There's a series of practices and learning opportunities. You have to go back and redo things. There's a lot more creativity associated with it, and a focus on taking action and seeing what happens, realizing that you're making an investment in learning so that next time you're more sophisticated and can do it faster and more efficiently. And again, it's much more collaborative than competitive. Here's one way I like to compare it to managerial thinking. I've done a lot of work with corporations and I've led companies, and there's a place for managerial thinking. Managerial thinking is when you say, okay, I know what the resources are that are available to me, and I know what the goal is, the target outcome. And so my job is to use planning to draw a line from those resources to that goal, right? So I'm work for a large company and my goal is to increase sales of this product by 5%. I have 2 employees, I have a $30,000 R&D budget and a $50,000 marketing budget, and so I'm going to put all of those things together over the course of the next 12 months and hopefully I will achieve that goal. And that's managerial thinking, and it's an incredibly powerful tool. It was arguably the revolutionary tool of the last 150 years towards creating the highly efficient organizations that we know and buy from. But it isn't entrepreneurial. Entrepreneurial thinking takes place when you remove one or both of those boundaries. Remember, the two things were the resources you have and the goals you want to achieve. So one way of doing this is saying, here are the resources I have. What could I accomplish with them? I have a certain amount of money, I have a certain amount of time, I have certain kinds of knowledge. What could I accomplish with that? The other one is to say, here's the goal I'm trying to get at. What resources am I going to need to get there, right? So that's the March for Our Lives example. The goal was to have an impact on how guns are used in society. And they then had to figure out what were the resources they were going to need in order to have an impact. Some entrepreneurial thinking removes both those boundaries. Like, you don't know what the goal is and you don't know what resources you have. You just know there's something you want to change. That's the most entrepreneurial. And it can be the most fun, but it's also the most uncertain. So here's a more clear comparison between managerial and entrepreneurial thinking, the focus being that entrepreneurial tends to be iterative and experimentation oriented, right? So you're going to take some chances, learn from failure, recognize that some information is unknowable, and you're going to act in order to learn. And as you learn, you'll become more knowledgeable and more ready to be more successful. So this is ultimately this idea that entrepreneurship is a practice and a mindset. And your book lays out these steps that you can think through in order to be prepared. So recognizing what your desired change is, right? That core aspect of my entrepreneurial definition. Start with what you have available. Describe the idea and calculate the sense of affordable loss. Like, what can you afford to lose in this process? Can you work on this for a year? Can you work on it for 5 years? Or do you only have a couple of weeks? Do you have money that you can spend on this? Do you have resources that can be deployed or no? Take small actions, right? So take those first steps. Don't just sit and plan and think for years and years and years. Take some small steps and see what happens. Where possible, network and enroll others in the journey. That's a key aspect of resource assembly, bringing together the network and connections. Build on what you learn. Recognize that failure is an inevitable part of this process. You're not going to get everything right. How can you learn from that? And then throughout the process, reflect and be honest with yourself. My experience is that the entrepreneurs who really understand what they're doing and what they're trying to accomplish are also prepared to recognize when they're wrong, how to make change when those situations develop, and when it's time to say maybe this isn't actually working. So I want to remind you of something I said in the introduction. I don't necessarily want you to be an entrepreneur. I want you to be whatever it is you want to be, as long as you're using your powers for good rather than evil. But I think that being entrepreneurial can help you get there, no matter where that journey takes you, right? This is this idea of entrepreneurship as a practice, because it's a very powerful set of tools. And that's what this class is designed to do, to give you the opportunity to explore that practice and try out the mindset of entrepreneurship, because I think that the way the world is changing and the speed of change and technological process means that these abilities and this framework will be only more valuable as time goes on.